The National Archives will give the House January 6th committee records relevant to Vice President Mike Pence, what he was doing, what was being said to him, maybe what memos were given to him. All of that is relevant to its ongoing investigation into the riot at the Capitol on January 6th. Former President Trump has attempted several times to prevent these documents released, but President Biden overrode those efforts. White House counsel Dana Remus said many of the records related to Mr. Pence's responsibility in certifying the 2020 election results. The archives will be given to the House committee at the beginning of March. For more, let us bring in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. Catherine, tell the audience the difference in the release of these Pence records and what difference it's going to make, which is really what's important, to the January 6th committee's investigation.
Major, this investigation by Congress and the Select Committee is really about creating a mosaic. So they're taking the emails, the text messages, the visitor logs, and they're starting to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. And now they're going to be able to overlay these records from the former Vice President Mike Pence and start to get at the issue of how much pressure was being placed upon him by his former boss, President Trump, January 4th, January 5th, and then, of course, on January 6th itself. And what's developing now is this interesting legal dynamic, especially for people who are deposed by the Select Committee in the future. You've got this immense paper trail that's growing, and the key issue is going to be whether these depositions are consistent with or in conflict with the paper trail. And then investigators on Capitol Hill will have to decide whether these are sort of honest discrepancies, whether they're misleading, or whether, in effect, these witnesses have intentionally lied to Congress. So what this paper trail is doing is increasing the legal risk for witnesses who are deposed in the future, Major.
Catherine, with your permission, I want to zero in on the point you just made a second ago so the audience can follow along. So let's imagine this. Let's say I'm witness X, and I've been asked to come before the committee, and I'm witness X, and when I testified and answered questions, there was still no clarity on whether documents were going to be given to the committee. So I may have said certain things, and now I know, documents are going to come to the committee. Do I have the opportunity, if I need to say, you know what, can I come back in, or maybe can I clarify something? Is that what we're talking about, this idea that people might have answered or been limited in their answers, thinking documents might never contradict them?
That's a great point. For a lot of people who are in former administrations, they leave the government and they don't take their records with them. They're not allowed to do that. They're government property. So if they're questioned in an investigation in the future, they do so to the best of their recollection. Now we have a case where records are now coming to light and available to investigators, which may not be consistent with their testimony. So they have a choice. They can either let it stand, or they can come back to the committee and say, I want to amend some of my answers in the deposition. And then it's up to the committee to decide whether these are, as I said, honest discrepancies, or whether there was something else going on behind the scenes. But, you know, the paper trail is so important because the document speaks for itself. But you need those human witnesses to provide context often, and then also this issue of intent. What was their intent when they decided to sit down in the Oval Office a couple of days before January 6th? The records say one thing. They may argue their intent was something quite different.
And you mentioned the word mosaic, and it seems to me one of the committee's motives or goals here is to try to make sure whatever it says, whatever record it establishes on the days leading up to January 6th, fold together neatly. That is to say, the testimony and the documentary evidence match. So the public really can have no doubt any longer about what the motives were, what the conversations were, what the trajectory of this work inside the Trump White House was leading up to that fateful day of January 6th.
You know, Major, from being in Washington for a couple of decades, that the timeline in any investigation is so fundamental to the success of that investigation. And you're correct, the Select Committee is trying to put the pieces of the timeline into place. Any good investigation will also acknowledge where there are gaps in the record. In this case, are there gaps in the record because very senior witnesses, former members of the Trump administration, declined to cooperate with the committee? For example, the former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, we're still waiting for a decision by the Justice Department, as to whether they'll bring criminal contempt charges against him. The Select Committee may ultimately argue that there are gaps in the record because they were not able to get the testimony and the statements from Meadows because he did not fully cooperate with them. So you're right. They want something that's really bulletproof so people can see what the timeline of events is, but they have to expect that there are going to be gaps in the record, and the smart strategy is to indicate why those gaps exist and whose cooperation might have filled those gaps.
On a related issue, the founder of the Oath Keepers gave a deposition today. What are we expecting? And in the main, how strong is the government's case against this particular defendant?
Well, based on our reporting here at CBS News, the founder of the Oath Keepers was in this deposition for about 6 hours. We still don't have a readout over exactly what was said. This was all being done virtually. The head of the Oath Keepers, as well as their legal team, who was outside of Washington. This is a very unusual case, and it's not a question why the Justice Department sort of rarely brings seditious conspiracy, because it has this very strong component of intent. The statute says basically that you need 2 or more people in coordination and concert who try to overthrow the government with their actions, or they try to delay the execution of a law, okay? You can see the paper trail in this case. You can see ample coordination between these parties, recruitment, training, the gathering of supplies, even going as far as to plan what they called the quick reaction force that was going to respond to the Capitol if they need it. That's a lot of coordination. That's the allegation. The question is, what was their intent? Was their intent to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College, and how convincing would that argument be, that evidence be, to a jury?
Catherine, many in our audience have been hearing for several days about draft executive orders seeking, if they had been carried out, which they weren't, but if they had been, to seize voting machines following the 2020 election. What do you know independently about these drafts?
What I know through my reporting here at CBS News is that there were at least 3 or 4 drafts of this executive order that were circulated. What I've been able to confirm is that the first series of drafts dealt with the Defense Department seizing these ballot counting machines. And then this went to what I'll call the Plan B, which was having Homeland Security seize the ballot machines. The goal of this group, and I'll call this sort of close legal advisors to the president, was to find a way in their mind to see whether these indicators of election irregularities were real or not by looking at the machines themselves. People at home can decide whether this was an appropriate line of exploration by them. I don't need to tell them that. But what's striking to me is that these were not one-off discussions, but they happened over at least 2 days, and there were multiple iterations as they tried to figure out whether this was an avenue they could ultimately explore.
And some of this, Catherine, has been hiding in plain sight. Patrick Byrne, the former CEO of Overstock.com, wrote a book, published, been out on the shelves for months, called The Deep Rig. He talks about this in the middle of the book, his conversation and others, urging the president to take these steps of seizing ballot boxes in order to conduct an investigation or overturn the election, and possibly both.
I have to admit, I have not read his book.
It's
should.
out there.
I'm glad you brought it to my. I'm glad you brought it to my attention. I guess the idea
my only point there is that some people who are involved in this are not at all reluctant to describe it, put it in plain sight, because they think they were doing something that was on the just side of the equation. Real quick, on another topic, there's a new Homeland Security bulletin warning about cyber attacks related to Ukraine, possibly in the U.S., possibly there. Catch us up on that real quick.
Well, Homeland Security has issued a new bulletin. We've reviewed it here at CBS News, and it talks about this uptick in online chatter. And in this case, they say it's part of a Russian influence operation, and they're pushing the narrative that Russia has no intention to mount any kind of military aggression against Ukraine, and that this has been manufactured by the U.S. and other Western nations to justify their military buildup around Ukraine. And what's striking about the bulletin is they say that companies, infrastructure in this country need to be on high alert, because if there was a perceived aggression by the United States, The likely response would be what I call a classic gray zone warfare response, which would be a cyber response. So infrastructure, energy, power, you name it, that's the kind of response they would expect.
With all the details, as always, Catherine Herridge.
Thanks for
so very
having
much.
me. Okay.
Thanks.